The problem is, though, that Beverly, and you've got a degree in theology, haven't you? The problem is, if you say that's the last word, this is what people argue. If you say that is it, that's what God said, that's the last word, because there's a huge, you know, within Islam, we have to acknowledge there's a modernising movement, there's a reformist movement, and there are massive debates going on at the moment. But there are a lot of people who think that's it, that's the final word, that's what he said.
But even modernists believe that.
Oh. Sorry, Marie. No. I grew up in a household which was charismatic Christian, Pentecostal. So the Word of God was, as far as the Bible was concerned, it was literal, from God's mouth. Now, you had members of my extended family who took that, as far as I was concerned, to the nth degree and would, you know, have rows whether women should wear trousers, is that scriptural or not, or, you know, whether women should have their hair in braids because, you know, that's stupid things that to me are trivial. But that just goes to highlight that in every single religion, particularly monotheistic religion, you are going to have different denominations who will interpret things differently. I grew up in Wolverhampton, everybody knows that. I've got mates who, you know, just everyday Mohammeds, shall we call them, who the name tells you that they were born into a Muslim family, but they go down the pub and they just like anybody else in Britain, and then you've got people like the Al-Jem Chowdhuries who are, as far as I'm concerned, monsters. There is a chasm between my mate Mohammed, who I went to school with, and Al-Jem Chowdhury, and yet both of them are classed as exactly the same thing in this country at this point. Why? Because the media has ensured that my mate Mohammed and Al-Jem Chowdhury are one and the same thing, when clearly they're not. Clearly they're not.
Julie, how do we get away from the lazy thinking and to excuse the media and to excuse the press, 9/11, 7/7, all the many people who call themselves Muslims and perhaps wrongly interpreted the text have, you know, plotted to murder people. So you can understand why there is a PR problem, can't you, Julie?
I think we can, but I think, you know, there's nothing else like it. I mean, our friend over here who was talking about
Which friend?
Over here on the front row here, that was talking about, who was talking about, you know, how Jesus and Jehovah, I mean, I can't remember the last time any of these things were mentioned in the newspaper, but constantly, daily, my whole life, effectively.
Well, recently Elton John gave an interview. Elton John said he thought that Jesus was gay. Now, if he had said that about, I hesitate to say it. I don't want to offend people. You know what I'm thinking. What would the reaction have been?
Of course, and to be honest, the reaction from some would have been completely unacceptable and over the top. What we're saying here is brilliant. I love the fact that Islam has a range of opinions and you can have a discussion. I love the fact that we have a panel, there's many people who have different views, etc. But I think people just don't realise when they say that Islam is skirted around and that Muslims are not treated badly in the press, I don't think people actually realise what it's like on a day-to-day basis for us to once again see things out in the open in a way that's just unacceptable and would not be acceptable with any other group of people.
That's why it's really...
Sorry,
we're not talking about Iran, we're talking about this country.
We're talking about this country. What happened to you in Iran was to do with the regime.
Shiva,
can I ask you a question? It was to do with the regime. It was to do with the misogyny in Iran. It was to do with the culture in Iran.
So how come before that it wasn't like that? How come before that? How come as soon as Islam...
Because people are misinterpreting the religion.
No, it's not. And they weren't Muslims. When the Islam... one second. When you hear about Islam a lot in media, just because of the political Islam, just because of the movement in general, how come you haven't heard about it 30 years ago, for instance? Because nowadays it's not individual anymore, it's political Islam. That's why it issues fatwa. And you saying the regime, before that, just mention to what you said, in Morocco, it's not state and the religion together. In monarchies, in the time before the revolution in Iran, they were considered themselves as a Muslim, but the state and the religion weren't together. Nowadays, the regime is under power, and they impose Quran, they impose Islamic laws.
Why didn't we hear about this 30 years ago? Because 30 years ago we had another bogeyman, they were called communists. Communists went away, now we have Muslims. 80 years ago it was the Jews, then it was the blacks, then it was the Irish.
I'll tell you
There's
why.
always a community that's demonised in Britain, sadly.
I'll tell you why.
Rashid Ali.
There is another distinction, which is the fact that, you know, looking at Khomeini was heavily influenced by Maududi. One of the things that Maududi's son writes in his biography is the correspondence between the two.
The Ayatollah,
Now, this was
yeah.
the Ayatollah Khomeini and Sayyid Maududi.
Let's not
Now,
go
this
too
was
far
a
back into
journalist who's
history
an
with a
Islamist.
minute in the debate
If I
left to
just
us.
finish. So, you had radical Islamists, and this was a movement that then took power in Iran. So you had a very radical interpretation that decided to become politicized and impose itself over the people, which is why you didn't have it 30 years ago. But Islam has been in Iran for centuries.
Because
so
we
it
make
is
an
it's to do
excuse
with
for killing
a very, very extreme politicized interpretation of Islam, which is enforced over the society. And that, I think, is where the problem lies.
Miriam, last word.
Yeah, no,
last word,
the issue
Miriam.
is the
Have we understood
misconceptions.
things better, do you think? Because of
Well,
this
after,
debate?
after
Yeah.
this debate,
Yeah.
oh, I'll leave that for the public to judge. But I would like to point out that these misconceptions have very real impact on people's lives. And this is the point, is that there was a report recently between a former anti-terrorism officer and the Exeter University looking at the way in which media reports and nationalist reports have had an impact on the motivations for assailants on Muslims. So clearly there is a link between the negative portrayals, the misconceptions then turn into prejudice and outright discrimination, and the fact that Muslims are seeing a rise in attacks on them. Islamophobia essentially is on the rise. So that, you know, this isn't something that we can sweep under the carpet. These misconceptions have a real impact on our
feel very
lives
strongly
as a
that-
community.
Do you feel angry that some of your fellow Muslims have kind of been to blame on this?
Do I feel angry?
With them.
I feel very disappointed and very devastated that the faith is so misrepresented in the public faith, and that the voice is given primarily to these people. I do think that there is this issue, and you know, you sort of confirm the point yourself when you bring up decontextualized quotes from the Quran. None of us refer to the Quran looking at one section out of context, and just because
But other people do, that's the problem.
Well, yes, but most people don't, and just because
Well, they do in
people-
Saudi Arabia,
and just
they do
because
in Iran,
people-
and they do right across the Middle
Sorry,
East.
one
That's-
second. And just because you believe something...
Wait, last word, Miriam.
And just because you believe something is the word of God does not mean that you take it literally. Now, that is
Okay.
a key point that needs to
We
be
have to leave it there. Thank
distinguished.
you. No. You can join in the debate by logging on to bbc.co.uk/the big questions. I imagine some people will. And you can follow the link to our message board and send us your thoughts about our last debate. Should voting be compulsory? And you can find details on our webpage of how to be in our audience. We're in Newcastle next week, Edinburgh on March the 21st. Then after a 2-week Easter break, we'll be back from London on April the 11th.